Okay, good morning again, everybody. And I want you to know I really appreciate your being here. I was saying to Robin before the meeting that I get nervous and I want to do a good job. And in particular, I want to make it relevant to our work in AA. And so I'm backpedaling a little bit this week, and it may be more big book than it is spirit the Ignatius, but I'm going to give it a go. So we're calling this one "Be Quick to See Where Religious People Are Right." That comes from it's in step 11 actually, where they're running through the three times of day when we pray. First is when we retire at night and tells us to review our day. And this is so close to the Ignatian practice of what they call the examine, not the examination of conscience. That's step 4. I mean, that's our step 4, but they call it the examine, and it's where they examine the uh, the part of the day they've just been through, and also the part of the day that they're looking ahead. Um, so that's the first part of step 11, as it's written in the book. Second part is on awakening, and it runs through a whole fairly elaborate prayer and meditation practice in the morning. And at the end of that part, it says, be quick to see where religious people are right. And of course, most of us are quick to see where they're wrong. And I think we do that. We practice our contempt prior to investigation, um, in order to give us an excuse as to why we don't have to make the effort. In my experience in AA, was that as soon as I read the steps for the first time and started to understand that if I was going to do this thing, I was going to have to make an amend to my ex-wife, the mother of my children. I just went into like this, and I'm a resentful person, and my sponsor kept saying, all I'm asking you for is to make a list of people you feel some resentment for, and I'm doing everything but, I'm doing a timeline of my life. I'm doing this and that, and I'm just, and I think what was happening was my human ego. uh, and one of the things I feel today that I did not see when it was happening, I don't feel my human ego wants me paying so much attention to God. I think it wants my full attention. I don't think it's God that's jealous. I think it's the human ego that's jealous. And I believe that it's the human ego that's cunning, baffling, and powerful, not the substance alcohol. And so I've watched my ego sabotage my work in here, and this was a good example. It didn't want me to get going on step 4 because it didn't really want to get anywhere close to step 9, because the last thing I wanted to say to my ex-wife was, I was raw. I was raw. I was wrong. I just was not. That's something I've been had trouble with all my life, and I couldn't get. Somebody would say, "Well, she didn't deserve the way you treated her," and I'd go, "Yes, she did," or whatever, um, and I really couldn't get to amends until I said, my sponsor said, would you want to be treated the way you treated her?" And the answer was absolutely not. Now I had something to go on, but I'm just trying to say that now I got to get back to what I was talking about. Oh, so be quick to see where religious people are right. So in preparation for this meeting, I was thinking about, well, what are you trying to do here? You got to make a case for how this is relevant to our work in AA. And I just thought through all of the since I've come into AA, and I did a lot of spiritual investigating, let's say, before AA. Um, particularly A Course in Miracles and Zen Buddhism. I had 5 years of experience at a Zen Buddhist meditation center, and um, so and since coming into AA, it started with Emmett Fox. He is just, in my mind, a brilliant um, author. It's a principle of his that he's not going to use a $10 word to prove to you how smart he is when he could use a $2 word, and he sticks to mostly $2 words. And I just found he can take terms and words that cause a negative reaction in me and interpret them in a way that is just much more positive. And one of those examples was the word wicked. He just has and we read it in one of our sessions. He says wicked means you're under a spell, and the worst part of it is you're putting yourself under your own spell. You're believing your own thinking. You're hearing this narrative you've been talking about for a long time, and that's under a spell. So anyway, Emmett Fox was the first. But I mean, I've read St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and I've read Imitation of Christ, a book, and Cloud of Unknowing, and I've dug into these things, and then probably was 5 years ago, I got introduced to this whole Ignatian thing, and as we go through this morning's session, we're going to talk about some parallels and some similarities. And I just have found nothing that has contributed to my practice of step 11. Nothing has contributed as much as this Ignatian stuff. It's just, I just love it. And so what we're doing in these sessions is we're dealing with two different 500-year-old documents. One is called the Autobiography of St. Ignatius, and the other is called The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius. And both of these books have been through countless translations because they were done in Spanish and Latin, and it's just remarkable. So, and the translations are all so different. So one of the challenges for me in these sessions is that I'm really running behind. My intention was to tell an Ignatian story called The Moor and the Mule, which is wonderful, but we're not going to get to it today. We'll hopefully get to it next week. But um, eh, eh, uh, so I'm running behind. I'm not as ready. When it's big book, I've been through that so many times. I've done these big book workshops, and I'm rock solid on the big book. But this stuff is new, and I'm kind of racing along, hopefully in front of you, trying to show you how relevant this is to our work in AA. And you've heard countless times in this interpretation of the steps, we do 1 through 9 to get to conscious contact. One is a bunch of information about our definition of Alcoholics and non-alcoholics. This doesn't come from the AMA. It's coming from our own work within alcoholism, and we spend a lot of time talking about the physical aspect, the mental aspect, the spiritual aspect. What I call that, for me, it's the allergy that I'm an abnormal drinker. I don't physiologically respond to alcohol the way normal people do. They stop. They stop at 1 or 2 or 3, and I don't. I don't stop. Period. The strange mental blank spot's my favorite. It comes from the story about Fred, because my life was good about everything except alcohol. And I just had this really strange mental blank spot about that alcohol was a contributor to my life, and not a detractor. And one of the great differences between our work in AA and the Ignatian thing is um, that that there's not a bottoming out process in the Ignatian spirituality. Jesuits come into this stuff at step 11. They're not coming in on step 1. They're not admitting power. They come in with a relationship with God and then do all the work trying to improve that. We don't. I have yet to meet anybody who, who came to came to their first AA meeting and declared, "Whoopee, I'm finally here. Now I get to start a relationship with God." That's not what, none of us come into this thing looking for a relationship with God. And most of us really resist the fact that the book keeps saying in many different ways. Carl Jung said it to Roland Hazard. Nope, I've never seen an alcoholic with a mind like yours recover. You're going to need a relationship with God. And Roland Hazard goes, well, I go to church. And Jung says, and this is so prophetic, well, going to church ain't going to cut it. It's just like in AA, going to meetings ain't going to cut it. You got to do a little more than just go to meetings. You got to get somebody to help you and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I'm trying to say that we do 1 through 9. We come to an understanding of our disease. We get a glimmer of the solution in we agnostics. We make a decision to treat our disease along the lines that the book sets forth. And then in step 3, it's saying, so if you're convinced, now my experience is a lot of people do step 3 and they're not convinced. And you don't find out till later on that they're not convinced. We're supposed to be convinced that we are powerless over alcohol and our lives are unmanageable. 2, no human power is going to relieve our problem. No human power. What's that? A power of the mind, a power of the body. That's not no new job, no new car, no new relationship, no new book on spiritual practice. Nothing of the human realm, no drug or physical procedure is going to solve our problem. And that we say God can and will if he were sought. We're supposed to be convinced of that before we make a third step decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. And then it says this, I wish we would read this in meetings. Then it says, if you are convinced of A and B and C, you are at step 3, which is you're going to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand God. Just what do we mean by this? And just what do we do? And if there's one question that shows up a lot, how do I know whether something is God's will for me or my ego's will for me? How do I know? You're asking me to make a third step decision to turn my will over to God, which I don't have a strong conviction about that. You're asking me to turn my will and my life over to and what they're saying is, what do we mean? What do we do? We do steps 4 through 9. The goal of steps 4 through 9 is something we call conscious contact. It's a term that comes from Emmett Fox. It's conscious contact. All it means to me is I no longer react and I no longer am doubtful when either me or you talk about God, higher power, whatever it is. I know that it's for real. I can't say much else, but I know the God thing is for real. And what is wonderful for me is that it's become the most important thing in my life. We often talk about these different levels of miracles that are stated in the book. And the first level is in the 10th step promises. And it says we will find that we're not even thinking about alcohol. The problem has been removed and we recognize that we didn't do that. That's the miracle of it. It just comes to us automatically. We didn't do that. But then there are 2 more. There's one where my consciousness of the presence of God in my life becomes the most important fact of my life. I might read it before we get done here, but I want to keep going through the steps. And then the third level is we will feel as though we are walking on the broad highway, hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. That's a whole different level. I get it now and then enough to feel like I understand it, but it's a whole different deal. The guy that talks about a spiritual experience at the end of We Agnostics says for the first time he lived in conscious companionship with the spirit of the universe, with God or whatever. And part of the Jesuit thing, where they're so much alike, they have a founder, they have a piece of literature, and they have a fellowship. They called it companionship. They were companions. That's what they called themselves, Jesuit companions, or the Society of Jesus. Um, so, at any rate, so we go through steps 4 through 9 to get something we call conscious contact, and when we get conscious contact, and it's predicted that it will happen halfway through amends. That's the 9 step promises are talking about. Um, Life changes. And step 10 is the beginning of a new way of life. And it says, there are some people that will read step 10 and 11 every day to remind them, we have entered the world of the spirit. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. If you hear anybody in a meeting of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous talk about 10, 11, and 12 as maintenance steps, would you please give them my numbers so I can, or give me their numbers so I can call them up and let them have it, because they are not maintenance steps. This step 10 says improve our understanding and our effectiveness. And step 11 says sought through prayer and meditation to improve. It calls it conscious contact, but you can call it my relationship with God. Um, I can say without arrogance or bashfulness, my primary purpose is to improve my relationship with God. And doing something like this is part of the way it goes for me. I'm starting to believe, because and this is coming from the Jesuit stuff more than the big book, but the big book, the end of step 10 talks about it. It's an amazing statement that also provides us with an amazing tool. It says, God, how can I best serve thee? Thy will, not mine, be done. These are thoughts which must go with us constantly. This is the proper use of the human will. Um, so I have not gotten a tattoo yet. I'd put it right here. It would say, God, how can I best serve thee? I'm not able to hold this in my mind throughout the day, but if my big book says, um, dwelling on the question, God, how can I best serve thee? Thy will, not mine, be done. These are thoughts which must go with me constantly. This is the proper use of the will. I want to try that, because everything else that it said to me has turned out to be way beyond what I ever imagined. I came into AA like most of you because I had a problem with alcohol, only to discover that I didn't have a problem with alcohol. Alcohol was my solution. Then I start finding out my real problem is with God. That's what I got a problem with. And then you find out, if you stick around long enough, that God is the solution, not the problem. But that takes prayer and meditation. So step 10, grow in understanding and effectiveness. That's another really important component to our work. Um, it is the first part is understanding. That's the same as faith. That's the same as knowledge of God's will for us. And the second part is effectiveness. That's bringing our faith into manifestation through service. In the Jesuit thing, they call it the call of the king. And I love their imagery, because you could say in AA, when you get to step 11 and it's saying, improve our conscious contact, praying only for knowledge of God's will for us. What is God calling me to do? And I got in here really late, and I was retired when I came into AA. So my primary purpose was no longer my family, which it is in earlier years, that you can't help it, and your work to support your family and your recreational opportunities, whatever that seems to be. And I'm sure I've said before that I've always been plagued by these four questions. How'd I get here? From an early age, how'd I get here? For crying out loud, what am I supposed to do while I'm here? What's going to happen after I die? But the one that really plagued me is, why can't I feel better than I do? Because I felt horrible about my life, most of my life, horrible, in spite of many blessings, many wonderful people. I haven't suffered physically the way a lot of people suffer physically, but I have never enjoyed my life or been close to serenity. I have, through this work, discovered that my ego has been promising me all my life, if you will do this, if you will get that, if you will avoid this, I will be happy. Me, the human ego, I will be happy. And so I did what it told me. And I was happy for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe, and then the ego's got another chore for me to do to make it happy. And I, at least I, I still struggle the exact nature of my wrongs. What's the exact nature of my wrongs? And as far as I get is, I believe this thing can think the truth. I believe this thing can lead me to salvation. Um, if it can add 2 and 2 and get 4, it can lead me to the truth. And I love step 11 when it's saying that this is really about growing the intuitive mind. We're working on hunches, inspiration, or decision, which means I hear something in my head that just says, do this. I've talked a lot about red light, green light. That's how because when it says ask God to direct our thinking, it's, whoa, hold on, and I can't say I felt God direct my thinking. And I've had to go, well, here's what I'm thinking. Can you give me a red light, a green light, or a yellow light? And then I can move on from there, either then to, well, claim the power to do it or not do it if I get a green light or a red light. Or if I get a yellow light, keep the conversation going. So anyway, I'm trying to say a major part of our thing is faith and work. Faith without works is dead. Having a great mental understanding of my life and the world and all this stuff is not enough. And one of the books that I didn't mention, um, there are two guys that are around. No, I'm not sure Keating's still alive, but Thomas Keating was a wonderful proponent of something called centering prayer. And one of his buddies, not in the same denomination, Richard Rohr. A lot of people in AA are very familiar with Keating and Rohr. And I'm not and Rohr even talks about contemplation in action. Contemplation is not enough. Getting close to God is not enough. What both AA and the Jesuit mentality are saying is, You got to bring your understanding into the marketplace, into the world. This is not about retreating from the world. And it's why I love so much the silver bullet of all of this stuff for me is just to the extent, we read it this morning, just to the extent that I humbly rely on God, and humbly is a key word because that's my problem. I arrogantly rely on God. I don't humbly rely on God. I'm working on it, but just to the extent that I humbly rely on God and I try to be the person that I think God wants me to be, not the person that Jack's human personality wants him to be. My ego's got a lot of specifications for a happy life. It wants this, this, and this. And I don't think that's not me asking God to mold my ideals and help me live up to them. That's me doing it. Me telling me what my life is supposed to look like. So we go through 1 through 9 to get to this thing called conscious contact, and then our lives are, and it's said again in different ways, our lives are about 10, 11, and 12 all the time. All the time, not just when we devote a certain time to it. And 10 is about mindfulness, 10 is the pause, 11 is the asking and listening, and 12 is then the doing. That's the effectiveness part, the doing in accordance with what we get when we try to listen to God's call for our service. The Jesuits are going to call it building the kingdom of God. God's call for my service in building the kingdom. We're not, that's not the way it shows up in AA. Although we do say, it's on page 83, we ask our Creator each morning in meditation to show us the way of patience and tolerance and kindness and love. Um, that's the kingdom of God. That's the serenity part. And so the silver bullet for me, humbly rely on God, try to be the person that I want, that I think God wants me to be, to fulfill my God's call for my service. If I will do those two things, I will be able to match, is the word the book used, or meet, or experience the human calamity which has been going on nonstop for thousands of years. Um, the drugs are stronger, the weapons are more destructive, but man's inhumanity to man has not stopped. And I'm going to be able to experience that with the serenity of knowing I'm trying to do my job as I think God wants me to do my job. And that gets back to primary purpose, what the primary purpose of your life is, and all of that. So, at any rate, what I'm trying to do is to make a case for why this in-depth study of Saint Ignatius, his story, and the spiritual exercises, um, why it's relevant to our work in AA, and that we are to use the techniques and the methods that he suggests um, in our work inside the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. So one of the interesting things to me is to uh, review the world's religions and and just to see how it's going. Because one of the remarkable things about our spiritual path in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is we don't have a dogma per se, or we don't have particularly a definition of higher power. We're told from the start, this will only work when you're working on your own conception of higher power. So we're available to, doesn't matter what the what religion you may be operating in. So it's interesting to me, the numbers could be way off. I don't know. But the surveys that they've done of the world's religions, they say that 32%, almost a third of the people of the world, not the United States, of the world, identify themselves as Christian. Now, an interesting thing in there is that of that 32%, 2/3 are Catholic and 1/3 are non-Catholic. Now, that's not true in the US, but this is worldwide. 32% Christian, 25% Islam, Muslim, 25%. And they're both from origins are the Middle East, which I find interesting. Then you get to the quaint word is Oriental, but it means the Eastern religions. And that's Hindu at I think 15% and Buddhist at 7%. And then there are another 15% of the world's population that don't identify. They don't identify with a specific religion. You could say they're agnostic. So that's a surprise. Only 15% of if you did that in the US, I think it would be a larger percentage that identify as agnostic. And then 7%, I think they call folk, maybe 6% folk, that where it's a indigenous, it's a local, it may be more local. I'm not sure about the definition, but it incorporates a whole bunch of different things, and particularly, well, Native American would be considered folk in our country, but there are a bunch of them. 0.2% are Jewish. That's a surprise. For their influence around the world, I would have thought it was higher than that. Although if you call it Judeo-Christian, because Jesus was a Jew and raised in that tradition, and that's the Old Testament, perhaps you'd think of it as a larger percentage. Any rate, so we are given our own conception. The St. Ignatius stuff is very Christian. So I have to do personally a good bit of translating what works for me, and when I'm trying to propose to you are there various methods of um, improving my relationship with the God of my understanding. And that's everything from the examine and the rules for discernment, which is really this whole thing for me is my goal is getting us to the rules for discernment, which are an appendix, like our spiritual appendix in the big book. They're an appendix to the spiritual exercises. They're not part of the spiritual exercises, but they define desolation and consolation, and then they are aimed at helping us make decisions so that we are able to answer God's call for our service, or however you think of it. The difficulties for me is there's quite a focus on Jesus, and there's talk of good and evil. There's the evil spirit and the good spirit. And I personally, you do with it whatever you want, but for me, it all makes much more sense to me if I define it as my human spirit and my soul spirit. And that's the way I experience it. It's not like there's this thing out there called the devil trying to tempt me to wicked, evil behavior. It's like my human nature has its wants and needs and fears and desires, and my spiritual nature has its wants and fears. I mean, its wants and needs and desires. I don't think it experiences fear. I don't think my soul is alcoholic. I know my body and mind are, but I don't think my soul is. And what's until this depression that I went through at 10 years sober, um, I would have told you I was living still basically 100% for my body and mind. And why I found it so intriguing, and we read it this morning, that Ignatius is saying, well, no, it doesn't matter if you have a long life or a short life, a rich life or a poor life, a healthy life or a sick life, an honored life or a dishonored life. That doesn't matter. I'm going, whoa, that's as hard as asking God to direct my thinking. What do you mean it doesn't matter? That's all that matters. And that's all that the world is telling me that matters. And why I am convinced, for me, that the more I am identified with my soul's agenda here on earth in this lifetime, and less identified with the spoiled brat nature of my human ego, wanting life on its terms, not life on life's terms, um, I am so much more relaxed and experiencing serenity, however you define that. Serenity for me is patient, tolerant, kind, and loving. Um, right in the midst of the world's human insanity, uh, clear insanity. And I think the power, the first step, didn't see it at the time, but is copying to, agreeing with, seeing my insanity, that my life is run by my mind. It's making the decisions, and why I find this discernment of spirits so powerful. So I'm going to end by reading a few things to you from the big book. I make all these notes, and then I don't say it. But let me just look through this stuff. Um, okay, I think we hit that and that. So I'm gonna read to you maybe a couple of things. So I find um, the chapter "There is a Solution" in these pages 25 through 29. They're just very powerful. And 25 starts with, there is a solution and you're not going to like it, and that's just a fact. None of us, we don't like doing this work. And why it's so important, I believe, even though the book says so little about it, that we find somebody in the fellowship who can help us move along. They look at this stuff. Somebody who has a relationship with a higher power of their understanding, and is ready to talk about the difficulties of that relationship and the wonderful parts of that relationship. There is a solution. You're not going to like it. The great fact is just this and nothing less. And I'm going to read it in I statements. I have had a deep and effective spiritual experience which has revolutionized my whole attitude toward my life, toward my fellows, and toward God's universe. The central fact of my life today is the absolute certainty. And this comes from Ignatius, beyond my ability to doubt. The ego is always doubting, but my spirit doesn't. That my Creator has entered into my heart and life in a way which is indeed miraculous, commenced to accomplish for me things that I could never do for myself. That's the truth. And then it says, if you're a real alcoholic, you only get these two choices, and we read it earlier. Um, Page 26 and 27, they go through this whole thing about Roland Hazard and Dr. Young, and I talked about it early. But the part that I love is, and I did mention this a couple of weeks ago, what Carl Jung didn't know. The miracle, if you get to page 27, the miracle of AA is what even though Carl Jung is a direct part of this miracle, um, what he didn't know. So, and that's where people will talk about our fellowship. It has two founders, Bill and Dr. Bob, but there are six people that had to do something at a particular time in order for Bill and Bob to be able to come together and start Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's two doctors, Dr. Silkworth and Dr. Jung. It's two ministers, Frank Buckman and Sam Shoemaker, and then two alcoholics, Roland Hazard and Ebby Thatcher. And they all had to do something for Bill to get to be sober. And what Jung didn't know is that at the same time that he's talking to Roland Hazard, Silkworth is starting to say, you guys are different physically. This is not just a mental problem. This is a physical, mental, and spiritual problem. You are different. You will never be able to drink safely. Jung didn't know that. He didn't know first you got to get sober. And the only way to get sober is you can't take the first drink. Because if you take the first drink, you're getting drunk. Your body will make you get drunk. And Silkworth and Jung also didn't know that Frank Buckman had started these Oxford groups and that they're in New York City where Sam Shoemaker is, and that's where Roland Hazard goes. And that's where he takes Ebby, and that's where Ebby takes Bill. So that's the miracle of it. And it's just, so then page 28, and we read this morning. If what we've learned and felt and seen means anything, it means that all of us, no matter what, can form this relationship upon simple and understandable terms as soon as we are honest, open, and willing enough to try. Just a beautiful statement. And then 29, each individual in the personal stories describes in their own language, from their own point of view, the way they establish their relationship with God. So, okay. And then, well, I guess I talked through the three levels of miracles, but I just want to read this one thing about Fred. Fred is the fourth story in more about alcoholism. And Fred was an accountant, a successful businessman, has a great family, high bottom drunk. He relapses, and then he's laying in the hospital. Two members of AA come in. They grinned, which I didn't like so much. They asked me if I understood what it means to be alcoholic and if I was really licked, if I wanted to do something. Then they start outlining the spiritual answer and the program of action. He says the program of action, though entirely sensible, was pretty drastic. It meant, and this is key, and this is key to our work. It meant I would have to throw several lifelong conceptions. This is on page 42, if you want to know. Several lifelong conceptions out of the window. That was not easy. And then he says, quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. And then he says, I have since been brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying and, I hope, more useful than the life I lived before. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. I would not go back even if I could. He's saying he can't. He can't go back. We drink without choice, and then if we do it, we recover without choice. There's not a choice about it. So thank you all very much. We're going to be meeting again next Sunday. I'm going to ring this gong, and Robin's going to stop the recording, and then we'll have some open discussion. Thank you.